We speak with Petra Belc, amazing film scholar from Zagreb, who has done tremendous research work on the history of Yugoslav cinema that is now forthcoming also as a volume. And my estimate is also that this volume and some of her material she has collected, but also the evaluations on the history of Yugoslav cinema will not just shed new light on some phenomena, but also will be a point of new interpretations. So thank you, Petra, that you are here with us to talk.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, I will start in a twofold way. So if both of those questions are maybe too broad or maybe too specific, please just correct me then. And the first thing would be, especially related to your own research as a film scholar, but also within your life as a person within a film community. First question would be, in a sense, somehow trying to pin down Žilnik's importance and relevance would be so what would you say was a major specificity of Yugoslav cinema, poetic traits or organizational modes, whatever. So what would be, let's say, something that was specific about Yugoslav cinema, so post-World War, Second World War cinema? What was specific in global terms or international terms? And B, then more specific, what was then the specificity of Želimir Žilnik within that framework of Yugoslav cinema? Please.
Thank you. It's a huge question. Well, I think that maybe one of the interesting traits of Yugoslav cinema can be pinned down within this segment of modernism, especially with the Makavejev and Genre Film Festival and Mihovil Pansini in Zagreb, Makavejev in Belgrade and Pansini in Zagreb. I think that the level of experiment they were doing was really just incredible. In terms of both form and content. And it's also a bit idiosyncratic because the form was kind of following the, let's say, Western mode of experimental cinema, whereas the content was very much leftist and Marxist. So from what I saw up to now, Yugoslav cinema, especially from the 60s, late 50s, 60s, and then early 70s, is really uncomparable to anything in the world. And when it comes to Želimir Žilnik, just as this book, Introduction to the Problem of the Past, which cannot be easily defined, I think Žilnik's oeuvre also can't be easily defined. He just crosses all the boundaries constantly, all the time. And really is one of the most exciting filmmakers in Yugoslavia, but also in the world, if I may say, especially because of his very unique approach or blending of documentary fiction and realism.
Talking about Žilnik's specificity, I would say for sure now is that, even if you take it in a broader sense of Yugoslav cultural history, that he's maybe one of the last, or maybe even the ultimate Mohican, still alive and being able to participate within the programs people organized around him and not just participate, being there a passive respondent, but also in a way actively steering the reception. So, this makes him already very specific. Since he started early on and was loaded, awarded early on with important festival prizes, which already back then would have made a career, even without his following all the films and also many other things that he has done. But let's say maybe come to the specificity again of Žilnik. You have had at the conference that was organized at Columbia University in New York last November, you have had intervention, which was probably, I would say, the most provocative and also the most stimulating one, where you have compared, especially something you have already said in regards to the Yugoslav cinema. So this kind of also the importance of, let's say, references from the experimental field from the West, especially.
Yes. So what I did is I basically made a video essay, like a comparative analysis of Žilnik's early works and Adolfas Mekas's Hallelujah, the Hills, with certain segments from the film Happiness by Alexander Medvedkin. And Medvedkin and Mekas were both filmmakers which Žilnik referenced as some sort of role models for his early works. What really was interesting in these early works in his film, or rather what interested me when I was trying to understand what he did with the form of early works, is how does the form, because Adolfas Mekas's film is really devoid of politics. Let's say it's an homage to cinema, and it has a very specific formal qualities. It's an experimental feature film, but it's not political, but it has a unique form. And Žilnik's early works, up to an extent, follow the form or are taking over or hijacking the form of Mekas's film. And what interested me is how does this form behave when it's loaded with the socialist or communist context? Because as we know, Mekas's film was done in a completely different environment, in a completely different ideological context. I can't say I reached any conclusions. Maybe the form is adaptable. And in Žilnik's film, I think it works perfectly in a way. He even won the Golden Bear for that film. It's interesting how he never returned to this experiment, I feel. His other films were following the poetics he established with his previous short films, but the early works stand as a unique phenomenon in the history of world cinema, and I think in the history of Žilnik's oeuvre. I had a great pleasure. I think it was a great thing that I got to spend an entire day with Želimir Žilnik in New York, the day during the marathon, and I think we talked for 8 or 9 hours. We just walked around and talked. And at one point he told me that he never really saw Mekas's film in entirety. He just glanced at it when he was in Oberhausen some years previously. And I think it's just a fascinating piece which kind of needs to be really deeply interpreted and understood.
You know, for myself, I had the feeling, especially, let's say, with the early works coming to that it is an amazing piece of cinema. And then, I mean, your estimate that he has never, so that Žilnik never had, in a way, follow up this way of films, or that early works stand out as a kind of a unique, singular case in his oeuvre. No, I would say, yeah, probably it is like, it seems that it is something very specific. But I always, you know, think what is so amazing with Želimir, but then also him not just being a filmmaker, but then being an important intellectual, sometimes even a public intellectual in a prominent sense, that somehow that he, and this maybe also could be turned toward the question of history, that once Želimir Žilnik has put you on screen, that in a way you as a protagonist, and some of his protagonists are his friends, are celebrities within the Yugoslav cultural scene, his friends, scriptwriters, other filmmakers, artists, that somehow he makes you a protagonist, but in a way he also immortalizes you, like almost within for the philosophers, this is always the figure of Hegel. Hegel, who in a way kind of sublates you, like elevates you, and then, but also in a way mortifies you. My estimate, for example, would be even going back just in that sense, that, for example, something like The Old School of Capitalism, his then a film from the 2010s, where he has again a prominent figure for the history of Yugoslav cinema, a marginally prominent figure like Lazar Stojanovic, who, and then also a couple of theorists from Belgrade and activists, be it from the anarchists or from the philosophical Lacanian strand, whatever. So you have people, some kind of protagonists who, within the film, they struggle. I mean, they converse. They somehow try to get to solve the riddle of history and politics. You know, I would say, I mean, this is still amazing. Like that, this extra cinematic thing. Where maybe, in my estimate, I would be in that estimate. Maybe I would, in a way, kind of going against what you said. But yeah, I would say that. For him, this makes interesting case. Coming back to New York, you know, for myself, I don't know if you had the experience that, especially for Žilnik's shorts, be it the iconic and the anthologized one from Yugoslav period, or be from his German period, that also the audience in E-Flux and in Brooklyn was amazing. I would say that was one of the most amazing screenings I ever attended, that the people responded to it. So maybe could you tell, I mean, like, since this is also a point of your research, that kind of cinema, have you some specific thought about that?
When you mention audience, I do have to say I went back home thinking how amazing audience in New York is. Because both in Anthology and in E-Flux, I heard some questions from the audience which would never occur to me or would never cross my mind. Or I've been present at several screenings of Žilnik's films here in Zagreb, where we know the context and where we somehow understand what he was trying to do. And yet, their questions found something else, or these people were able to pin down some things, both in form and content, that I really didn't think of here. I can't remember now exactly the same, what things were about. But with Žilnik's films, I think there is this wow effect, which at first you don't see or you don't understand what's going on. Only subsequently, after you saw the film, or when the film is nearing the end, or on the second viewing, that's at least my experience of his films, you suddenly understand, and then you are amazed by what he really did. With me, it happened with the Ustanak u Jasku. The first time I saw the film, maybe I was younger, maybe I didn't understand the historical importance of the place, maybe I wasn't thinking about partisans, maybe I was tired that day. But when I realized what he pulled off, the simulation of the war or the imitation of the war, with the completely without any artillery, with just common people who were also in a way participating, it was both a mockery and a ironic commentary and something very, very real. And I think that in Žilnik's films, as in all great works of art, although Žilnik says he's not interested in art, but I think he makes profound art, is that there are layers and layers and layers of things that can be recognized by people with their specific interests. For me, this is this unbelievable crossing of all filmic cinematic boundaries. You cannot put Žilnik's work in any of the clusters, in any of the genres, in any of the genuses. So that's what amazes me with Žilnik's work, and it's constantly new.
Tell me also, I mean, a specificity that was so often, but it was something already back then when those films were produced. People already in late 50s and 60s in Yugoslav cinema, there was a sense of the importance of cineclubs. And then the organization, let's say, formed I mean, what was, I would say, also specific that at some point you have a generation of filmmakers who have grown up within the context of cine clubs and then becoming, because also of the specificity of a real socialist state, in a way becoming mainstream, or at least in organizational stance, having larger productions and also being loaded. I mean, being also important for countries' cultural development, not just the marginal independence. So this kind of a thing where you have someone who is, let's say, comes from a independent underground and becomes mainstream in a way, but also like with Zhilnik, Makaveyev, Alexander Petrovich, or others at some point in the 1970s, all of them, or most of them, have also become dissidents in some way, and also have been censored, have been deprived of production possibilities within Yugoslavia. I mean, what would you say, let's say, in regarding also to this organizational format, the Zhilnik, in a way, still, I would say, maybe stands heroically, almost like as being DIY, being a proponent of DIY ethics. Could you maybe elaborate about what was so specific about the organizational form, but also maybe about the poetics of Yugoslav cinema that came from this cine club attitude?
Well, first of all, the cine club films enjoyed, or people who were gathering around cine clubs enjoyed tremendous freedom, and they were rule breakers, and they were therefore sometimes very deliberately pushing the boundaries. But also, I think it was a community of people who were interested in different cinematic expressions, and there in cine clubs they found kindred spirits. With Zhilnik, what I admire the most is how, after winning the Berlin Film Festival with his early works, he really unconformistically stayed on his path. I bet that any other director, I mean, I bet that the door to Yugoslav mainstream cinema after that award were open for him, and for some reason he decided to insist on his own position, and this is the position he still occupies today. So this kind of courage and sincerity and honesty and artistic and professional integrity is something very, very, very rare. And that's why I think Zhilnik, is just a great filmmaker. This is one thing. The other thing is the cine clubs kind of provided just a free space to experiment, but you also got to work with the equipment there, which was kind of also very rare at the time. So his youthful spirit, the fact that he was able to work on the equipment in Kino Klub Novi Sad, I think kind of course, were reasons why he was a part of the Cine Club Novi Sad. What was making me sad a bit, well, I was researching this Yugoslav experimental cinema period of the 60s and the 70s, is that Zhilnik didn't really like formal experiments such as those that were made in Zagreb. Back then I couldn't really understand why. Now I do understand why, because they did lack a bit of, let's say, political or activist momentum. Although this was not just pure formal experimentation because of experiment itself, they were really trying to understand what cinema as a medium is and what cinema as a medium could do. Something that was not something that people in Yugoslavia in the late 50s and 60s, early 60s weren't really aware of, the capacity of cinema to make a change or to think for us or with us. And I think maybe Zhilnik's early works wouldn't be possible if there wasn't GEF, and if there weren't kino clubs or cine clubs, and if there wasn't this really just huge thought of theoretical thought about cinema, which was also, I think, partially due to Dusan Stojanovic, who was also attending cine club screenings, at least these ones during the GEF in Zagreb. And Dusan Stojanovic, who I think worked at the Institute of Film in Belgrade, also helped to translate so many important theoretical works into Serbo-Croatian or Croato-Serbian language, Serbo-Croatian. And I think it kind of rubbed off of those people, because Yugoslavia was really tremendous in terms of keeping up with all the contemporary theoretical things. So yes, kino clubs were important, and I think that Žilnik's way of filmmaking wouldn't be possible if there wasn't this cine club spirit.
Tell me, I mean, one of the things, let's say, Želimir's hybrid or DIY ethos, whatever we call it, let's say this would be rather on the organizational or maybe even a formal part of his persona. The other one, I mean, is his interest into people marginal. And this is also something, is a sense of a content that partly shares some similarities to the so-called Yugoslav new cinema, or the Black Wave, but then also stands out in its persistence up until today, be it the marginal in a sense of homeless people, of the gender minorities, or probably most important and most prominent with the Roma, immigrants also. In your research, and I mean not just in your research, but in your cinematic activism as a programmer, and you yourself very much immersed and focused on those, not just the figures of marginality, but also authors who had been marginal back then or marginalized later on, especially women filmmakers. Could you maybe also tell something about that? And if there is something you could think of that would be, not necessarily, I mean, a connection to Žilnik's own ethics of filmmaking. So elaborate a bit about those, I would not call them blind spots, but those uncharted territory filmmakers who just in retrospect have become important or will become important also due to your own research and promotion.
It's interesting that you chose not to call them blind spots, because I think they are blind spots, and mainly because these women or these people or these authors were extra institutional. And who creates canons? It's mainly institutions, and institutions like institutional artists. So everything that's outside of institutions and does not want to be institutionalized will therefore be a blind spot. But let's say it's an uncharted territory, and once the institutions recognize the relevance and importance of these authors, they will chart them or put them back in the field. When it comes to DIY, I think it's important to note that when you work with a small crew or with a small camera, you have great freedom of action, great freedom of reaction to everything. And I think it's perfect for what Žilnik is doing for his work. And when it comes to marginal people in his work, and you mentioned the Yugoslav Black Wave, I think there is a difference, because Yugoslav Black Wave was a feature film. And as in general in let's say new waves or such political feature films, authors do focus on social inequalities and on marginal people. But what Žilnik did is, because he's not making fiction films, he really focuses on real people, and that's a huge difference. And I think you can't make up these stories. And when it comes to women, there was a significant number of women who worked within cine clubs or were adjacent to cine clubs. But for some reason, even in the early 1970s, when there was this really important conference, Drukca žena, in Belgrade, in SKC, where Yugoslav feminists or new Yugoslav feminists gathered for the first time in this institutional setting, there was already existing a body of work of these women that were creating since the late 50s and then throughout the 60s. But for some reason, these institutional feminists, even if they were activists in terms of the state feminism, the feminism which was propagated by the state, they still failed to include or even see or even recognize the work of these women. That's why I think it's not just an uncharted territory, but a true blind spot. But it's also a bigger problem in terms of the institutions and the purpose of institutions. Of course, the history also belongs to institutions, does it? But then Žilnik kind of comes and takes it away from the institutions and then presents his own version of history, which I think has more depth and humanism and accuracy.
But what will you say, let's say, in your estimate, for example, if you take now the case of Žilnik, my intuition would be that Želimir has become much more important also, not just to his politicality, in a sense that he, in a way, was always opposing regression or autocracy, whatever we call it, be it in the Yugoslav times, socialist Yugoslavia, or afterwards. That my intuition would be somehow that, from what I understand, is that it was maybe hard in the 60s or 70s or 80s that especially, for example, some women filmmaker, that they would hardly get inspired. Maybe they were inspired by someone like Žilnik as a big figure, important figure of Yugoslav cinema, but it was then rather later on with the newer generations of people who got exposed to this kind of films. And also my second thing would be that in a sense, it seems like not just because Želimir is still alive, fortunately, that Želimir was probably the most important figure, much more important than maybe even Makavejev or all the other big names, because the idea, the ethos, and also the DIY approach was so fresh. It was still young. So, I mean, what would you say? I mean, have you seen, for example, I mean, do you know by some already example that Želimir, again, just taking him as a case, that already back in the late 60s or 70s, that he was inspiring for other filmmakers in a way maybe marginal or marginal as today, that had been inspired by Žilnik's approach? I mean, do you know of such cases, or that it was rather later on?
I would, so I have to say I haven't noticed, but also I haven't noticed that there were, let's say, any women that were particularly inspired by his DIY approach. Although these women whose films I did found didn't really leave any kinds of written traces or any kinds of interviews. So it's impossible to really know. I think there was a shared experience of such filmmaking. So maybe it would be best to ask Žilnik directly and personally, does he know if he helped someone make a film? I'm sure he did. Yes, that's a really difficult question. I think this actually the non-existence of any kinds of written traces from these women filmmakers is something that really makes it very difficult for us to understand these films. Also, to understand their work. Although there is one author who is still alive, Bojana Vujanović, and I'm in contact with her. She did study in Lodz, in this famous film school in Lodz with Francis Lag. But Francis Lag is no longer here, so we can't ask him. And then Bojana left Lodz for London, and then there I think she studied at King's College. Unfortunately, upon returning in Belgrade, she never really continued working with film, because there were no opportunities for women, especially the ones who are non-conformist. So she was translating, but the films she did were really, really very, very great. And all of these women worked with these small Super 8 lightweight cameras, reacting immediately and spontaneously to everything that they saw, as was the case with Tatjana Ivančić. And I know it's totally, her work is incomparable to Želimir Žilnik's work, both in terms of attitudes towards life and poetics. But this moment that I think they share is the moment where you can directly respond to the environment and to the stimulus and to what's in front of the camera. And that's something what's unique to cineclubs.
Thank you. So maybe for conclusion, I'll just open for you maybe some thoughts that you could share with the listeners. I mean, on not just on Žilnik, but let's say on the context. Let's say in the context would be somehow researching upon the history of cinema in Yugoslavia and in post-Yugoslav realm. I mean, how do you see it? I mean, what's your estimate? I mean, had been done enough, or I mean, what would you say would be, in some more international regard, what would be maybe the blind spots of research or promotion that you would like to be corrected and put more focus on?
Thank you. That's a fine question. And I think I have an answer which also interests me a lot, something that I also would like to work on more in the future, and that's Yugoslav film theory. Yugoslav films, both modernist and political films, like the new wave films, but also the more commercial ones, I think, yes, they definitely need more attention. But I think something that went under the radar is really Yugoslav film theory by Yugoslav filmmakers and film theorists proper. Because what I mentioned earlier, the Dusan Stojanovic, his character and how he influenced and shaped cinematic thought in Yugoslavia, I think is definitely unique. And when you read some of the works by Belan or Pansini or Stojanovic himself, I think that there are some true gems that still need to be discovered. Yes, so I would say Yugoslav film theory and cinematic thought is something that's worth pursuing and slightly unearthed up until now.
Thank you very much, Petra.
Thank you for inviting me.